Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck tech for you from the new set Phyrexia All Will Be One. And just a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck tech, so there are going to be some expensive cards in there, although I think it shouldn't be too hard to find substitutions for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy these videos. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me, and we're currently growing the channel, and it helps me a lot. Much appreciated. And today we are focusing on Geth, Thane of Contracts from the new Phyrexia All Will Be One set. And if you don't know what Geth does, for 1 colorless and 2 black, it's a 3/4 legendary creature, Phyrexian zombie. With other creatures you control, get -1/-1, and 1 black tap, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else, and activate only as a sorcery. So right off the bat, we've got pretty good stats here. A 3/4 for 3 is ahead of the curve. In black, we've got a repeatable reanimation ability for 3 mana, which is incredibly solid. But the downside, of course, is that other creatures you control get -1/-1, and that is usually quite a big downside. But I didn't want to just build a generic reanimation deck because I thought it would be a pretty boring commander if we did that. So instead, what I thought is, how can we turn that downside into an upside? And the main way I'm doing that is by exploiting death triggers of creatures. Now, obviously, we can't use normal aristocrats cards because most of those have a toughness of 1, so that's not going to work. So we had to be a little bit more creative here. And in the end, I think I came up with a super cool list that I'm actually really excited to play. When I started making it, I was just making it for the channel, but eventually I think I will probably end up putting this together. So before we get started and go through the card by card, I'm going to mention that from now on in these videos, I will not be talking about generic mana rocks or removals since they're included in most decks, and it's pretty straightforward what they do, so I'm not really going to spend time explaining what they do. However, if you want to see the full deck list, you can still find it in the link in the description. And we're starting with Abhorrent Overlord. Now this is one of the stars of the deck because it's going to make a bunch of 1/1s when it enters the battlefield. Those 1/1s are all going to immediately die to Geth and going to trigger all of our dying triggers. It's also a great one to reanimate with Geth because it's going to provide all that trigger over again. Very solid card in the deck. Ayora First of Locthwain is a pretty solid card because it's an aristocrats card that works on creatures ETBing, and it has a toughness of 3. That means we can actually use it in this deck. It's also going to allow us to sacrifice one of our creatures so that then we can reanimate it again with Geth. Very solid and should provide a lot of damage. It's also 3 devotion for stuff like Abhorrent Overlord. Butcher of Malakir is a great one since we're going to have so many token creatures dying to the -1/-1 of Geth. This is going to mean that our opponents need to sacrifice something every time. Canoptek Scarab Swarm is an absolute all-star in this deck because we can deal with somebody's graveyard, which is something we want to do anyway. And then when we do, we're going to get an absolute ton of 1/1s that are all immediately going to die and trigger all of our effects. There are also artifacts, which is going to work very nicely with Marionette Master, as you'll see in a bit. Chittering Witch gives us 4 bodies, 3 of which are going to die immediately. Crypt Ghast is obviously very good in any mono black deck. It just about survives Geth, and then we can actually pay the extra mana we get in order to extort. Douthie Voidwalker is obviously very good in any mono black deck. It provides 2 devotion, and it's going to mess with our opponent's graveyards a bit. Since we can reanimate it with Geth, we can also get a second use out of it, which is nice. Dreadhound is another aristocrat style card that survives Geth, so we can bring it down later on in the game, and it's going to trigger a bunch of times when all of our little tokens die, and should kill our opponents fairly quickly. Drivnod Carnage Dominus is fantastic in this deck with all the death triggers we have. It's going to trigger a bunch, and we can't run Teysa Karlov, sadly, so this is a pretty good one to run in her stead. Endrixar Master Breeder is absolutely amazing here. One of the best cards in the deck. I used to have a commander deck built around him, and he's an awesome commander in his own right, but here it's going to work so nicely because we're going to get throws that are going to immediately die, which means we're never going to be at risk of losing Endrixar to his first ability. It's going to trigger all of our death abilities over and over again, and our opponents are basically going to have to waste a removal on this. Erebos Bleakhearted is going to let us draw cards whenever our creatures die. It does cost quite a bit, but we have a few ways to recoup the life, and then it's also a nice sack outlet so that we can reanimate stuff with Geth. Falconwrath Noble is an aristocrat card that survives Geth. Gravecrawler is one of the best, if not the best card in the deck because for 1 mana, you can trigger all of your death triggers as many times as you want with Geth on the battlefield. Geth is a zombie. That means you can play Gravecrawler, which is going to immediately die to the -1/-1 from Geth. Gonna trigger all those death triggers, and then you can just rinse and repeat. If you have Pitiless Plunderer out, that is infinite and should probably result in a win. If you don't have Pitiless Plunderer out, you can just go and go and go for each black mana you have. Very, very solid. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is a great way to win the game in any mono black deck, and we should have quite a bit of devotion in this deck. Marionette Master is going to be really sweet. The first time we play it, we can put counters on it, and then any other artifact creature that we create with any of our other effects, and we have quite a few of them, is just going to drain our opponents for 4, which is absolutely brutal. Marsh Splitter comes with 3 bodies and is going to immediately die to Geth. We can reanimate it, and then we're going to get another 3 bodies. So it's not the strongest card in the deck, but that's a lot of triggers, and that can be pretty good. Morbid Opportunist is going to draw us cards. Mere Battlesphere is another excellent one in the deck. It makes artifact creature tokens that are immediately going to trigger Marionette Master, and it comes in with 4 bodies that die immediately. You can't really get much better than that for this rate. Nadir's Nightblade is a great Aristocrats card that is specific for tokens, but that's most of the stuff that we have in this deck. And then Nadir himself is obviously very good because we're going to get a bunch of counters on him whenever our tokens die the first time, and then whenever he dies, we're going to get an absolute mountain of tokens that all immediately die to Geth. So at the very least, we're getting 2 1/1s when this dies, but it's probably going to be many more, and this could just win you the game on the spot if you have enough ways to drain your opponents. Phyrexian Vivisector is going to give us a nice little scry whenever one of those tokens dies. Pitiless Plunderer is obviously an excellent combo card, but we can just use it fairly in this deck. We don't really need to be going off with it. It's going to work pretty well as a quote-unquote fair card. All the same things that apply for Gravecrawler apply for Reassembling Skeleton as well. It just costs 1 mana more, but it's, again, easy to get a lot of value out of this, and we can even do this one at instant speed, so we can just leave our mana open, and if we don't have anything to do, return this a bunch of times to get a bunch of triggers. Sanguinary Priest is another Aristocrat style card. Sling Gang Lieutenant is basically just another Marsh Splitter. You're never going to get to use the sacrifice ability, but 3 bodies for 1 and 3 triggers for all of our death triggers is often going to be good enough. Sir Conrad the Grim is another Aristocrats card that is going to ping our opponents for an absolute mountain of damage. Underworld Hermit is another version of Abhorrent Overlord that's going to look at our devotion and make a bunch of 1/1s that are going to immediately die. Venom Crawler can get absolutely huge in this deck with very little effort. If you play Geth on 3, this on 4, and then follow it up with any sort of token generator on 5, which is not a particularly unlikely sequence of events, you can end up with this as a 4/4 of a 5/5 on turn 5, and it just gets bigger and bigger from there, and the lifelink is very relevant in this deck. Vindictive Vampire is another Aristocrats effect. Vorgar Necropolis Tyrant is a pretty new card, but it's very solid in this deck, so it only triggers on stuff that dies during your turn, but that's when most of our stuff is going to be dying anyway, and then when it dies, we're going to draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it, so we do want to have some ways to sacrifice it at instant speed, which we do, so that our opponents don't exile it. Weaponcraft Enthusiast is the best version of the 3 trigger creature because it only costs 3 mana, and it's going to make 3 bodies that trigger our death triggers 3 times. Yeheni Undying Partisan is a great card in any Aristocrat style deck, so it's going to be able to sacrifice stuff so that we can reanimate it with Geth, and it can make itself indestructible as well, and since we have a lot of ways to kill our opponent's creatures, this should also get quite big. Next up, we're moving on to artifacts. We have Bontu's Monument. Since we have so many creatures in the deck, this is going to help a ton, and we do need ways to gain back life. This is also another way to drain our opponents. Conjurer's Closet is going to make sure that we can reuse those creatures that we play for their ETBs. Obviously, it doesn't work well after you reanimate with Geth, but it does the first time you play them. Crowded Crypt can trigger on tokens, so this is going to get a bunch of counters, and then we can turn them all into creatures with Decayed, which of course have to be sacrificed after they attack. Oh, what a pity that we're going to get all those dying triggers. Expedition Map is there for one reason alone, which is to search for, you've guessed it, Cabal Coffers. Genesis Chamber is going to be excellent in this deck as a way to make sure we get a token every time a non-token creature comes into play. So this is just going to add an extra body to every single one of our creatures, which is really fantastic. They also happen to be artifacts, so they work with Marionette Master. Lightning Greaves is there to protect our commander because we do want to make sure that Geth stays alive so that it can kill all of our own creatures. Mimic Vat is an excellent effect that's very similar to Geth. We can just repeatedly keep casting the same creature over and over. Panharmonicon is going to double all of those ETB triggers, and we have a lot of those in this deck. Vat of Rebirth is going to get counters incredibly easily. It's probably about as good as Geth itself in this deck, since we're going to get so many counters, it's very easy to just keep reanimating stuff with this. Weatherlight Completed is a card that a lot of people seem to have forgotten about, I think. It's very cheap at the moment, only $1.66, but it's going to scry a lot in this deck, and it's so easy to turn on, and at that point you're drawing a card every time a creature dies, and you have a 5/5 flyer for 2 mana, so that's pretty fantastic in this deck. Moving on to sorceries, we have Agadeem's Awakening to bring back a bunch of creatures from our graveyard late game, very solid. Exsanguinate is going to help us finish the game. For enchantments, we have Agent of the Iron Throne, which is an excellent way to keep draining our opponents. Usually these backgrounds are a little bit worse because you need to have your commander in play, but without our commander in play, our creatures aren't really going to be dying that often anyway, so this one doesn't really have that downside. Bastion of Remembrance is another Aristocrats effect. Black Market is going to be super solid because so much stuff is dying that this is going to have an absolute ton of counters and it's going to let us do some nice stuff. It works particularly well with Gravecrawler and Reassembling Skeleton in this deck. Dark Prophecy gives us 3 devotion and it's going to draw us a ton of cards. We do have to be careful sometimes if we're getting low, but we have enough ways to gain life that it should be okay. Dictate of Erebos is a great way to make sure our opponents are hurting whenever we're sacrificing creatures. If you have Grave Pact, you can include that as well. I don't have it in this list because I was running out of slots, and also it's a very expensive card. Shadows of the Past is a solid one because it allows us to scry every time a creature dies. That's great. And then it has a nice little mana sink that should always be on in this deck because we're going to have so many creatures hitting the graveyard. And since we have so many ways to make a ton of mana, this is actually a pretty good mana sink to have. Finally, the Meat Hook Massacre is another expensive card, but it is a very good one in this deck. Not so much because of the board wipe, but more because of the Aristocrats effect. Finally, we have our instance. We are running Malakir Rebirth to protect our commander. Plumb the Forbidden as a nice way to draw some cards and get creatures into the graveyard so Geth can reanimate them. Saswell is a great way to deal with the graveyard and our opponent's strongest creatures, but then we're also getting a bunch of 0/1 tokens, which are immediately going to die and trigger all of our effects. Very good. Tragic Sleep is a removal spell that is almost always going to be on in this deck, so it works really well. For Planeswalkers, we have Lolth Spider Queen. Now, we can have some absolutely crazy turns with this out because she's going to get so many counters that we can sometimes ultimate out of nowhere. But we can also just use it to draw a card and lose a life, which is fine as well. And then Liliana Dreadhorde General is going to draw us an absolute metric ton of cards. It's one of the best cards in the deck, obviously. It also allows us to put our big creatures into the graveyard with the -4 so that we can reanimate them with Geth. And finally, we're moving on to lands. We have Bojuka Bog to deal with opposing graveyards, Cabal Coffers and Cabal Stronghold to add a ton of black mana. Crypt of Agadim is going to do the same, but it's a little bit less efficient most of the time. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is obviously great in any monocolor deck. It's a pretty expensive card, but it's a very good one in this deck if you can afford it. Tectonic Edge is going to allow us to deal with our opponent's lands. Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is going to make sure that our Cabal Coffers hits for as much as it can, and War Room is there to draw some extra cards. So there you have it. That has been our Geth Thane of Contracts deck tech. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!